Today, the New Zealand 22.4% house price growth crisis. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian and New Zealand perspective. Well, it's all coming to a head now, because in the latest monetary policy statement from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, they're forecasting a house price inflation rate to peak at, wait for it, 22.4% in June this year, before falling to 12.2% by the end of the year. And of course, the policy committee's statement is its overarching plan for how it will formulate monetary policy under different circumstances to achieve its objectives, and then agreeing and publishing a strategy which is meant to promote transparency, public understanding and accountability. But I think it's gone off the rails. The February 2021 edition was an absolute doozy. They said the domestic recovery has been uneven. Although the economy has rebounded strongly, this has not been the case for all sectors. Much of the recent strength in activity has been seen in the construction and retail sectors. Robust housing market activity has encouraged an increase in building consent issuance and resident investment and bolstered household wealth. As a result, retail spending has been strong, and there's been a more resilient labour market, and household balance sheets strengthened, and there were also higher asset prices and a redirection of spending from international travel to domestic goods and services. But demand for goods and services exposed to international tourism remains weak. The absence of international visitors continue to act as a drag on economic activity and has been only partially offset by an increase in New Zealanders touring domestically. The continued absence of international tourists will become increasingly pronounced in the economic data, they said. And the number of overseas visitors in New Zealand would typically peak in the summer months as seasonal domestic tourism subsides. Although the economic recovery has been much stronger than anticipated at the outset of the pandemic, the outlook remains highly uncertain and contingent upon the path of the virus and the speed and efficacy of global vaccination programs. Underlying momentum in activity in the labour market will depend on the duration and strength of the headwinds facing tourism-related sectors and regions, and the extent to which ongoing weaknesses in these sectors spill over into the broader economy. So their baseline scenario assumes the unemployment rate will peak at 5.2% in mid-2021, reflecting ongoing challenges in tourism-related sectors. And they said fiscal policy is expected to remain stimulatory for several years, albeit less stimulatory than previously assumed. Increasing house prices, they said, have been a contributor to the recovery in the construction and retail sectors. They're forecasting a house price inflation rate to peak at 22.4% in June this year, before falling to 12.2% by the end of the year. And some of the factors contributing to high home price inflation in 2020 are assumed to wane during 2021. Strong construction activity is assumed to alleviate some supply pressure. And the effect of high migration prior to the border closure is expected to decline, as migration has been low since March 2020. And the reintroduction of restrictions on high LVR lending for owner-occupiers and investors, and the tightening for the latter, is also assumed to dampen further house price increases from June 2021. Now, they introduced a range of new tools over 2020 in response to the pandemic. They took a number of monetary policy actions to support the New Zealand economy. Those, of course, included lowering the official cash rate to 0.25% and providing forward guidance that that rate will stay at that level until at least March 2021. They launched the large-scale asset purchase program, under which the Reserve Bank helps to lower long-term interest rates by purchasing New Zealand government and local government funding agency bonds, and launching the Funding for Lending program, which aims to lower the cost of borrowing for businesses and households. And that program does this directly by providing low-cost funding to banks and indirectly by reducing the cost of banks and other sources of funding. A higher proportion of New Zealanders' wealth is now in housing. House price gains over 2020 reflected a variety of demand factors, they said, in the face of significant impediments to housing supply. High inward migration prior to border restrictions being implemented is likely to have contributed significantly to the increase in house prices. And they said, in addition, lower interest rates and the removal of LVR restrictions have made mortgages cheaper and more accessible to home buyers, contributing to stronger demand. And the resilient labour market has also been playing a supporting role, helping to underpin home loan serviceability. Residential investments have increased in response to strong momentum in the housing market. Consents for residential developments spiked over the latter half of 2020, suggesting strong construction activity will continue. But recent levels of activity appear to be generating significant capacity pressures in the construction industry, and capacity constraints could limit scope to further scale up residential investments in the near term. Now, that 22% house price forecast changed significantly compared with the one from November, reflecting just how fast actual prices have risen. Between January last year and January this year, they rose just over 19%, according to the REI. In November, there were forecasts from the Reserve Bank and CoreLogic that prices would be around 7.9% higher for the year to June. Now that forecast is 22.4%. But prices are forecast to fall from that level later in the year. House price inflation is forecast to fall to 18.4% by September and then 10.2% by the end of the year. And then by March 2022, the Reserve Bank reckons house price inflation will be running just 3.9%. So that blip is massive and fading away. Question is, can you believe it? Do they know what's going on? Or don't they? Well, significantly, Finance Minister Grant Robinson has decided to change the remit of the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee from the 1st of March, requiring it to assess the effect of its actions on the government's housing policy. And they must now directly consider house prices through the way it regulates the banks. The committee retains autonomy over whether and how its decisions take account of potential housing consequences, but it will need to explain regularly how it has sought to assess the impact on housing outcomes, Robertson said. In the exact words of the remit, in pursuing its inflation and employment targets, the Monetary Policy Committee has to assess the effect of its monetary policy decisions on the government's policy. The remit stipulates that the government's policy is to support more sustainable house prices, including by dampening investor demand for existing housing stock that would improve affordability for first home buyers. Now, the Reserve Bank, of course, was a very vocal opponent of Robertson's proposal late last year, which would require them to consider house prices when setting monetary policy, arguing it would be rather made through their other actions. But now a direction has been made that the Reserve Bank must consider the impact of housing policy. The Reserve Bank's objectives and mandates remain the same, which is to maintain price stability, support full employment, and promote a sound and stable financial system. And Robertson also asked the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to provide advice on restricting borrowers' debt-to-income ratios and interest-only mortgages. I want to understand the extent to which interest-only mortgages, particularly to speculators, pose risks to financial stability and whether restrictions should apply. Some jurisdictions, like Australia, have in the past applied restrictions on interest-only mortgages due to financial stability risks, he said. Following the bank's request that the government allow it to make use of tools such as debt-to-income ratio limits, I've asked for further advice on how the bank might implement such tools. I've made it clear that in principle I would want these to apply only to investors. It's important that any potential restrictions do not disproportionately affect first home buyers and low-income borrowers. Today's announcement is just the first step as to how the government considers broader advice to cool the housing market. We know the rapid increases we've seen in recent months are not sustainable, which has meant many first home buyers are struggling to access the market. We'll be making further announcements in the coming weeks on other policy responses. Now, in response, the Reserve Bank issued a statement saying that they welcome the direction it's received from the Ministry of Finance. The bank is tasked with considering how it contributes to the government's housing policy objectives, consistent with its financial stability objective for promoting a sound and efficient financial system. The Ministry of Finance has announced he expects the Reserve Bank to have regard to house price stability when making its financial stability policy decisions. The Minister's direction is in tune with our recent advice to the government, they said, including the actions of the Reserve Bank. The direction under 68B of the Reserve Bank Act requires the bank to have regard to the impact of its actions on the government's policy of supporting more sustainable house prices, including by dampening investor demand for existing housing stock, which would improve affordability for first home buyers. And the Monetary Policy Committee targets, meanwhile, remain unchanged. That is, to maintain stability in consumer price inflation and to contribute to maximum sustainable employment. However, the bank will be required to outline, among other things, the impact of its decisions on the government's housing objectives. And the replacement MPC remit, which is effective from the 1st of March 2021, requires the committee to assess the effect of its decisions on the government policy. Mr. Orr says that the adjustments increase the focus on understanding and communicating the impact of the bank's decisions on house price sustainability. We have a long-standing commitment to transparency about our policy actions and approaches, and this will continue, Mr. Orr said, and the bank welcomes the Minister's request for more information and analysis on debt-to-income ratios and interest-only mortgages, and will respond in due course. This is a mess, frankly. 3 points to make. Firstly, remember that inflation does not directly link through to house prices because of the way that inflation is measured. That was a decision taken some years ago. So the CPI will understate the true cost of housing. The second is that clearly the Reserve Bank has been found wanting here. They've released the taps too far and fast and have been surprised by what's happened to the housing sector. And thirdly, the impact on first-time buyers is pretty disgraceful. In fact, people who are buying now, right at the peak, are likely to be left stranded as prices ease back, because the growth rates that we're talking about are completely unsustainable, the debt levels are too high, and this is going to end in a massive mess. The question is, can they allow prices to settle in a controlled manner? Or will these changes of direction and ultimately later an increase in rates really turn the market turtle? I don't think that people have fully appreciated just how vulnerable the housing market is in New Zealand as it is in Australia. And recent interventions by central banks in both countries, frankly, have created greater financial stability risks rather than alleviating them. And that is something that they should be held accountable for. But it looks to me as though, once again, it will go through to the keeper. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.